The world's richest man just declared war on the European Union. Elon Musk just pulled the trigger, and Europe is in total chaos. In a move that stunned Ursula von der Leyen and sent shockwaves through every European capital, Musk announced the complete withdrawal of both Starlink and X from the entire European Union. 450 million people woke up to find their internet satellites gone, and their social media platform vanished overnight. Von der Leyen's response? Total silence. No press conference, no statement, just frozen shock as a man she tried to destroy proved he held more power than she ever imagined. What just happened will change everything. The confrontation erupted like a digital earthquake, breaking apart the carefully built appearance of European unity. For years, the European Union positioned itself as the guardian of the internet, the protector of citizens against the wild west of American tech giants. Under Ursula von der Leyen's leadership, Brussels created a collection of regulations designed to bring Silicon Valley to its knees. The Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act, each one a tightening rope around the neck of innovation, each one celebrated as a victory of European values over American capitalism. But behind the press releases and the carefully staged photo opportunities, something far more sinister was taking shape. A system of control that would make George Orwell's Ministry of Truth look amateur. And Elon Musk just ripped the curtain away. The explosion happened in early 2026, but the fuse had been burning for months. Sources close to the matter revealed that European Commission officials had been quietly approaching X, formerly Twitter, with a proposal that would fundamentally change the platform's operations within EU borders. The deal was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. X would put in place a shadow moderation system, invisible to users, that would quietly suppress content considered problematic by Brussels. Not illegal content, not terrorist propaganda or child exploitation, but political viewpoints, scientific debates, and criticism of EU policies that the Commission found inconvenient. In exchange, the billions in fines threatened under the Digital Services Act would disappear. X would be held up as a model of responsible platform governance. And Musk would be welcomed into the club of compliant tech billionaires who understood how the game was played. But Musk doesn't play by anyone's rules. Instead of quietly accepting the offer or politely declining, he did something that sent panic through every level of the European bureaucracy. He made it public. In a series of posts that reached hundreds of millions of users, Musk exposed the entire scheme, naming officials, describing the proposed censorship mechanisms, and attaching leaked documents that proved the European Commission was operating a systematic program to control digital speech across the continent. The response from Brussels was immediate and harsh. Spokespeople denied everything, calling Musk's claims conspiracy theories and misinformation. But the documents were real. The email trails were verified. And journalists across Europe began asking questions that officials couldn't answer. The financial warfare began within hours. Under the Digital Services Act, the European Commission has the authority to charge fines of up to 6% of a company's global annual revenue for violations. For X, this translated to a potential penalty exceeding 200 million euros, a sum large enough to hurt even Musk's vast financial reserves. But von der Leyen wasn't content with just fines. She wanted total surrender. Commission officials began writing orders that would block X entirely within EU member states, cutting off 450 million citizens from the platform overnight. The message was clear: comply or be destroyed. No middle ground, no negotiation, complete submission to Brussels' vision of digital governance or total exile from the European market. Musk's counterattack was precise and devastating. He turned immediately to von der Leyen's most vulnerable point, her own transparency failures. The Pfizergate scandal had been simmering for years, a controversy involving secret text messages between von der Leyen and Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla regarding multi-billion euro vaccine contracts during the pandemic. Those messages mysteriously vanished, deleted, or hidden, never produced despite multiple legal requests and a European ombudsman investigation. The hypocrisy was staggering. Here was the president of the European Commission demanding total transparency and data access from private companies, while her own communications about public contracts involving taxpayer money had disappeared into a black hole. Musk hammered this point relentlessly, framing each new demand from Brussels as the action of a hypocrite who operated by one set of rules for herself and another for everyone else. But the most damaging weapon in Musk's arsenal wasn't about money or regulations. It was about legitimacy. With surgical precision, he began using a phrase that cut deeper than any legal argument could: unelected bureaucrat. Two words that exposed the fundamental flaw in the European Union's governing structure. Von der Leyen was never directly elected by European citizens. She was selected by member state leaders and approved by the European Parliament in a process so unclear and complicated that most Europeans couldn't explain how it worked. In an era of rising populism, declining trust in institutions, and widespread anger at political elites, this was gasoline on an open fire. Musk wasn't just attacking a policy, he was attacking the entire legitimacy of EU governance, questioning whether unelected officials in Brussels had any right to control what hundreds of millions of Europeans could see, say, or share online. The political establishment reacted with fury and fear. Mainstream media outlets across Europe, many of them dependent on EU funding or favorable regulatory treatment, launched coordinated attacks on Musk. He was labeled a threat to democracy, a spreader of misinformation, a billionaire megalomaniac drunk on his own power. Opinion pieces warned that his defiance could destabilize the entire European project. Politicians demanded action, calling for immediate enforcement of the DSA and complete removal of X from European digital infrastructure. Yet beneath the outrage, there was something else: panic. Because Musk had done something no other tech CEO had dared to do. He had called their bluff. Every previous confrontation between Silicon Valley and Brussels had ended the same way. The tech company would negotiate quietly, agree to certain compromises, pay some fines, and life would continue. But Musk refused to negotiate. He refused to compromise. And he made it clear that he would rather lose the entire European market than submit to what he called digital tyranny. The escalation entered a new phase when von der Leyen announced her Democracy Shield initiative, a program supposedly designed to protect European elections from foreign interference and misinformation. The language was careful, the presentation polished, but the implications were clear. The EU was creating a permanent infrastructure for content monitoring and control that would operate year-round, not just during election periods. Independent analysts quickly pointed out that the proposed systems would give EU officials unprecedented power to flag, suppress, or remove content across all major platforms operating in Europe. The definitions of misinformation and harmful content were deliberately vague, allowing broad interpretation and enforcement. Critics warned that this wasn't about protecting democracy. It was about controlling the narrative, ensuring that only EU-approved viewpoints received wide distribution, and silencing dissent under the guise of security. Musk's response was immediate and inflammatory. He labeled the Democracy Shield a global censorship machine and called for von der Leyen to submit to a direct election if she truly believed in democratic accountability. The challenge was brilliant in its simplicity. If you claim to represent European citizens and protect their democratic rights, let them vote for you directly. Let them decide if they want you controlling their digital communications. The proposal sent shockwaves through Brussels because everyone knew it would never happen. The entire structure of EU governance is built on layers of indirect representation and bureaucratic insulation precisely to avoid direct accountability to voters. Musk had exposed this fundamental contradiction and forced it into the public conversation in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere in the Berlaymont building became toxic. Senior advisors were split into warring factions. One group argued for maximum enforcement, believing that showing weakness now would invite challenges from every tech company and undermine the EU's regulatory authority across all sectors. Another faction warned that making Musk a martyr could trigger a populist backlash that would dwarf Brexit, potentially destabilizing the entire union. Every option carried catastrophic risks. Banning X would outrage millions of Europeans and potentially violate principles of free expression the EU claimed to uphold. Backing down would humiliate von der Leyen personally and prove that Brussels could be defied with impunity. The paralysis was complete. For the first time in decades, the European Commission faced an opponent it couldn't regulate, negotiate with, or intimidate into submission. What makes this confrontation historically significant is not just the personalities involved or the immediate stakes. It represents a fundamental shift in the balance of power between states and individuals. For centuries, the Westphalian system assumed that governments held ultimate authority within their territories. But Musk controls infrastructure that crosses all borders, satellites that orbit above all nations, and a communication platform that reaches more people than most governments could ever hope to address directly. He possesses resources that rival the GDP of mid-sized countries and the ability to shape global conversation in real time. When he defies the European Union, he isn't acting as a corporate executive negotiating with regulators. He is acting as a competing power center challenging the EU's authority to control digital space within its own borders. This is unprecedented, and Brussels has no playbook for how to respond. The implications extend far beyond Europe. Governments worldwide are watching this confrontation with intense interest and growing alarm. If Musk successfully defies the EU, it establishes a template for other tech billionaires and companies to follow. It proves that with enough capital, infrastructure, and public support, individual actors can challenge the regulatory authority of even the most powerful political unions. Conversely, if Brussels successfully crushes Musk and forces X out of Europe, it demonstrates that governments can still enforce digital borders and control information flows within their territories. The outcome of this battle will determine whether we live in a world where nation-states retain ultimate authority over digital communications, or whether we are entering a new era where individuals with sufficient resources can operate as sovereign powers unto themselves, beyond the reach of traditional governance structures. As tensions reached a fever pitch, Musk made his most provocative move yet. In a lengthy post, viewed by over 500 million users globally, he called for the complete abolition of the European Commission in its current form, arguing that it had become an unaccountable bureaucracy that served its own interests rather than European citizens. He proposed replacing it with directly elected officials subject to regular referendums, creating true democratic accountability for EU governance. The proposal was treated as madness by the political establishment, but polls showed that significant portions of the European population, particularly younger voters, found the idea appealing. Musk had tapped into a reservoir of frustration that Brussels had tried to ignore for years: the disconnect between EU institutions and ordinary citizens, the sense that decisions were made by distant bureaucrats who faced no consequences for failure, the feeling that European democracy was more procedural than real. These sentiments had been building for decades, and now Musk had given them a voice and a platform that reached every corner of the continent. But here's what nobody saw coming. What makes this confrontation truly explosive and impossible to predict. Deep inside the European Commission, a small group of officials began quietly compiling evidence that Musk's platform had been systematically amplifying specific political content in ways that violated EU election laws, not just allowing it, actively promoting it through algorithmic manipulation. They were preparing to unveil allegations that would make the current fight look like a warm-up. Accusations that could transform Musk from a defiant billionaire into a criminal defendant facing prison time in multiple EU member states. The nuclear option was being prepared, and neither side was backing down. The question wasn't whether this would explode. The question was, who would survive the blast? The evidence being compiled in Brussels was unlike anything seen in previous tech regulation battles. This wasn't about content moderation policies or data privacy violations. European Commission investigators had spent months analyzing X's algorithm, tracking how posts were distributed, amplified, and suppressed across the platform. What they discovered sent chills through the upper levels of EU power. According to internal documents that began circulating among select officials, X's recommendation algorithm had been systematically boosting political content that aligned with specific ideological viewpoints while suppressing opposing perspectives. The pattern was consistent across multiple member states during critical election periods. In Germany, posts critical of green energy policies received disproportionate reach. In France, content questioning EU immigration policy exploded across feeds. In Italy, anti-establishment political figures saw their engagement rates multiply overnight. The conclusion drawn by Commission investigators was explosive. Musk wasn't just running a social media platform. He was operating an illegal election interference operation across the entire European Union. The legal implications were staggering. Under EU law, systematic interference in member state elections constituted a criminal offense, not just a regulatory violation. If prosecutors could prove intentional manipulation, Musk wouldn't just face fines. He could face criminal charges in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. European arrest warrants could be issued, assets could be frozen, extradition requests could be filed. The billionaire who thought himself untouchable could find himself unable to travel to Europe without risking immediate arrest. Von der Leyen's team saw this as the ultimate leverage, the weapon that would force Musk to capitulate or face personal destruction. But they were making a critical miscalculation. They assumed Musk would react like a normal corporate executive, hiring lawyers, seeking settlements, quietly backing down to avoid criminal exposure. They didn't understand that they were dealing with someone who viewed this confrontation as existential, not just for his business, but for the future of free speech itself. Musk's intelligence network was better than Brussels anticipated. Within days of the investigation intensifying, details began leaking to his team. The response was immediate and characteristically aggressive. Rather than waiting for formal charges, Musk went on the offensive, releasing internal X data that told a very different story. Yes, the algorithm had changed. Yes, certain content received more distribution than before. But the reason wasn't political manipulation. It was the deliberate removal of previous suppression mechanisms that had been quietly throttling conservative and anti-establishment voices for years. What European investigators called election interference, Musk called leveling the playing field. He argued that X's previous algorithm, designed partly to appease European regulators, had created an artificial information environment where EU-approved viewpoints dominated while dissenting voices were shadow banned into obscurity. By removing these restrictions, he hadn't manipulated elections. He had stopped manipulating them. The data Musk released was damning for Brussels. It showed that during previous election cycles, when X was still Twitter and trying to maintain good relationships with EU regulators, the platform had implemented region-specific content filtering that disproportionately affected right-wing and populist political content. Emails between former Twitter executives and commission officials revealed a cooperative relationship where the platform regularly received guidance on what types of political speech were considered problematic. The guidance was never framed as censorship demands, always couched in language about combating misinformation or preventing hate speech. But the pattern was clear. Twitter had been quietly doing Brussels' political dirty work, suppressing voices that challenged EU orthodoxy while claiming to be a neutral platform. When Musk took over and removed these mechanisms, more in the natural political reaction diversity of European public opinion finally became visible online. That's what terrified the European Commission. Not that Musk was manipulating the conversation, but that he had stopped letting them manipulate it. The public reaction across Europe was explosive and deeply divided. Mainstream media, particularly outlets in Germany and France, that maintained close relationships with government officials, framed Musk's revelations as conspiracy theories and deflection. They argued that a billionaire with obvious political biases couldn't be trusted to run a neutral platform, and that his claims about previous censorship were attempts to justify current manipulation. But on social media itself, a different narrative was emerging. The millions of Europeans who had felt their voices were being suppressed finally had an explanation. The tweets that never gained traction, the political opinions that seemed to vanish into the void, the sense that online discourse didn't reflect the conversations happening in real life. It wasn't their imagination. It had been systematically engineered. The anger wasn't directed at Musk. It was directed at the institutions that had been caught red-handed trying to control democratic discourse while claiming to protect it. Von der Leyen faced a crisis of credibility unlike anything in her tenure. Opposition politicians across the political spectrum, from left-wing privacy advocates to right-wing populists, found common cause in demanding answers. If the Commission had been secretly coordinating with social media platforms to suppress political speech, what else had they been hiding? Parliamentary inquiries were launched. Press conferences descended into shouting matches. The careful consensus that had allowed the EU to function began fracturing along ideological lines that no amount of diplomatic language could paper over. And Musk kept feeding the fire, releasing new documents every few days, each one revealing another layer of coordination between Brussels and tech platforms. The drip, drip, drip of revelations ensured the story never left the front pages, never gave the Commission time to recover or change the narrative. But the European Union wasn't defenseless. Behind the public relations disaster, a counteroffensive was being planned that would target Musk's greatest vulnerability: money. Despite his enormous wealth, X was not profitable. The platform had been losing cash since Musk's acquisition, sustained only by his personal fortune and his willingness to absorb losses while rebuilding the business model. European regulators recognized this weakness and began weaponizing it. New guidance documents emerged from various EU regulatory bodies, not formal laws, but interpretative frameworks that would govern how existing regulations applied to social media platforms. The language was technical and bureaucratic, but the effect was devastating. Under these new interpretations, X would be required to implement expensive content monitoring systems, hire thousands of compliance officers in European offices, submit to continuous audits, and face potential daily fines for even minor violations. The cost would run into billions annually, far more than X generated in European revenue. The strategy was elegant. They couldn't ban Musk outright without looking authoritarian, but they could make operating in Europe so expensive and legally risky that he would have no choice but to withdraw. Musk saw the trap immediately. This wasn't about enforcing safety standards or protecting users. This was economic warfare, designed to bleed his company dry, until he couldn't afford to fight anymore. His response shocked even his closest advisors. Instead of trying to negotiate or find ways to reduce costs, he announced that X would cease all direct operations in European Union member states. Not a withdrawal or a ban, but a restructuring. The platform would remain accessible to European users, but the company would have no physical presence, no offices, no employees, no legal entities within EU jurisdiction. All operations would be handled from outside Europe. If Brussels wanted to fine him, they would have to chase him across international borders. If they wanted to enforce regulations, they would have to figure out how to apply European law to a company that no longer existed within European territory. It was a move of breathtaking audacity, essentially daring the EU to enforce digital sovereignty in a world where borders meant nothing to data flows. The legal chaos that followed was unprecedented. European authorities issued orders to internet service providers demanding they block access to X. Some complied, others refused, citing concerns about censorship and freedom of expression. Users discovered VPNs and proxy servers, maintaining access despite official blocks. The tech-savvy shurikerites circumvented restrictions within hours, while less sophisticated users found themselves cut off from a platform that had become central to their professional and personal lives. Small businesses that relied on X for marketing suddenly lost access to customers. Journalists who used the platform for news gathering found themselves hamstrung. Political activists across the spectrum, from climate protesters to anti-immigration campaigners, lost their most effective tool for organizing and communication. The backlash wasn't directed at Musk. It was directed at the governments that had made their digital lives more difficult without solving any actual problems. Inside the Berlaymont building, the situation had become untenable. Von der Leyen's approval ratings were collapsing. Member state leaders were receiving angry calls from constituents demanding their social media access be restored. The business community was furious about the economic disruption. Even traditional media outlets that had supported the crackdown were losing traffic as users migrated to alternative platforms or found ways around the blocks. The EU had wanted to demonstrate strength and regulatory authority. Instead, they had created a public relations catastrophe that made them look simultaneously authoritarian and incompetent. They had picked a fight they couldn't win cleanly, and every day the conflict continued made them look weaker. But Musk was also paying a price. European revenue from X had dropped to nearly zero. Advertisers were fleeing the platform, concerned about the regulatory uncertainty and political controversy. His other companies, particularly Tesla, faced implicit threats of regulatory retaliation in European markets. The European Investment Bank began reviewing whether Tesla projects should continue receiving favorable financing terms. Environmental permits for manufacturing facilities faced sudden additional scrutiny. It was becoming clear that Brussels intended to make Musk's entire business empire pay for his defiance, not just his social media platform. This was total war, fought not with armies, but with regulatory agencies, tax authorities, and bureaucratic procedures that could strangle companies slowly without ever issuing a formal ban. The breaking point came from an unexpected direction: Poland. A member state that had long maintained an uneasy relationship with Brussels over issues of judicial independence and media freedom, announced it would not enforce the X blocking orders within its territory. The Polish government argued that access to information was a fundamental right and that EU directives requiring censorship violated both Polish constitutional law and European human rights conventions. Within days, Hungary followed suit, then Czech Republic, then Slovakia. The unified front that Brussels had assumed was crumbling along the same fault lines that had caused previous EU crises. Western European states remained committed to enforcing the restrictions, but Eastern European members were openly defying Commission orders. The European Union, already struggling with questions about its legitimacy and effectiveness, now faced the prospect of member states simply ignoring its directives when they found them inconvenient. Von der Leyen faced an impossible choice. Escalating against Poland and Hungary would require triggering Article 7 proceedings, the nuclear option that could suspend their voting rights and potentially lead to their exit from the Union. But using that weapon over a social media dispute would be political insanity, likely driving even more member states into open rebellion. Backing down would prove that Commission authority was meaningless when challenged by a determined opponent with sufficient resources and public support. Every option led to institutional damage. The carefully constructed image of the EU as an effective, unified regulatory superpower was disintegrating in real time, and the entire world was watching. Elon Musk sensed the weakness and moved in for the kill. He announced a new initiative called Digital Sovereignty, a suite of technologies and services designed to help individuals and organizations operate online without government surveillance or control. Encrypted communications, decentralized social networks, peer-to-peer payment systems that bypass traditional banking, all built on infrastructure he controlled through SpaceX's satellite network. The message was clear. If governments wouldn't protect digital freedom, he would build the tools for people to protect it themselves. It was a direct challenge, not just to the European Union, but to the entire concept of state control over digital communications. And it was resonating with millions of people worldwide who were watching Europe's attempted crackdown with growing alarm. The geopolitical implications finally forced other powers to take positions. The United States, which had tried to remain neutral, began making quiet diplomatic overtures, suggesting that aggressive action against American tech companies could trigger trade consequences. China, seeing an opportunity to drive a wedge between Western allies, offered European nations access to alternative social media platforms while simultaneously praising the EU's regulatory efforts as necessary resistance to American digital imperialism. Russia amplified both sides of the conflict, using state media and troll farms to make the situation seem even more chaotic and irreconcilable than it actually was. What had started as a dispute over content moderation had metastasized into a full-blown crisis, testing the foundations of transatlantic relations and the future of global internet governance. As summer 2026 approached, the confrontation had reached a stalemate that satisfied no one. X remained accessible in parts of Europe and blocked in others. Musk continued releasing damaging documents about EU censorship coordination. Von der Leyen clung to power while her authority eroded daily. And across Europe, citizens found themselves caught in the middle of a conflict they never asked for, unable to access services they had come to depend on, watching their elected leaders flail helplessly, while an unelected billionaire and an unelected bureaucrat fought over who should control their digital lives. The anger was building, the pressure was mounting, and everyone knew that something had to break. The only question was what, when, and how much damage it would cause when it finally did. But the real shock, the revelation that would change everything, was still hidden in the shadows, waiting to detonate. Because neither Musk nor von der Leyen knew that a third player had entered the game, and this player had evidence that would destroy them both. Who was watching from the darkness, and what did they know that could bring down the entire system? The battle for Europe's digital future hangs in the balance. Musk has exposed the machinery of control. Von der Leyen's authority crumbles daily, but the real war has only just begun. As governments worldwide watch this unprecedented confrontation, one thing becomes clear: the age of unquestioned institutional power is ending. Whether that leads to freedom or chaos, nobody knows. The next move could reshape governance for generations. Who will control your digital reality? The bureaucrats who operate in shadows, or the billionaire who refuses to play by the rules? The answer will define the 21st century. Drop your thoughts below and subscribe because this story is far from over.